November 8, 1942, 2:47 a.m., outside Casablanca, Morocco. Oberfeldwebel Klaus Hoffmann peered through the vision port of his Panzer IV Ossif G, watching American infantry stumble through the pre-dawn darkness during Operation Torch. The veteran tank commander, who had crushed French armor in 1940 and burned Soviet T-34s across the Ukrainian steppes, allowed himself a thin smile as he observed the green American troops. In his 23 months of combat, Hoffmann had learned to recognize doomed men when he saw them. "They're carrying pipes," his gunner, Unteroffizier Ernst Weber, reported with barely suppressed laughter. "Herr Oberfeldwebel, the Americans are attacking us with metal pipes." Through his periscope, Hoffmann studied the odd tubes slung over the shoulders of several American soldiers, roughly 5 feet long, with a primitive-looking cone at the front, and what appeared to be crude wire mesh forming a horn at the rear. The weapons looked like something assembled in a school workshop, utterly inadequate against 40 tons of German steel and armor. "Poor bastards," Hoffmann muttered to his crew. "Their general sent them to fight Panzers with carnival toys. This will be a massacre." What Oberfeldwebel Klaus Hoffmann didn't know, what none of the German tank commanders positioning their armor that morning could have imagined, was that he was staring at the weapon that would systematically demolish the myth of Panzer invincibility. Within 18 months, that crude tube would become the most feared anti-tank weapon on the battlefield. German tank crews would abandon their vehicles at the mere sight of American infantry carrying the M1 Bazooka. Experienced Panzer commanders who had survived Kursk and Normandy would later say they feared the bazooka more than they feared enemy tanks. This is the story of how American ingenuity and desperate improvisation created a weapon so effective that it changed armored warfare forever. How a device dismissed as a toy by German professionals became their worst nightmare. And how the laughter of veteran Panzer crews turned to screams as their supposedly impregnable armor became death traps. The weapon that would terrorize German armor was born from desperation and genius in equal measure. In May 1942, Lieutenant Edward Ull, a young engineer at the Aberdeen Proving Ground in Maryland, was wrestling with an impossible problem. The U.S. Army needed a lightweight anti-tank weapon that infantry could carry and fire without specialized training. Every solution tested had failed. The Army had tried anti-tank rifles, too weak against modern armor. They experimented with explosive charges on poles, suicidally dangerous. They tested anti-tank grenades. Effective range? Approximately the distance a man could throw while being shot at by a tank, which is to say not very far. Ull was examining a discarded metal tube, part of a failed rocket experiment, when inspiration struck. What if the tube wasn't meant to contain the explosion, but simply to aim it? What if the rocket could be fired from an open-ended launcher that the soldier could carry on his shoulder? The concept was revolutionary in its simplicity. Unlike conventional weapons that required heavy barrels to contain explosive force, Ull's design would let the rocket motor's exhaust vent harmlessly behind the shooter. The tube would merely guide the rocket in the first crucial seconds of flight. Working with Colonel Leslie Skinner, Ull assembled the first prototype in June 1942. It consisted of a simple steel tube, a crude electrical firing mechanism, and a shaped charge rocket borrowed from an experimental Swiss design. The entire weapon weighed 13 pounds. A man could carry it all day and still have energy to fight. The first test firing took place on June 14, 1942. Ull shouldered the tube, aimed at a target tank hull placed 50 yards away, and squeezed the electrical trigger. The rocket whooshed from the tube with a distinctive sound, a loud whoosh, bang, that would become intimately familiar to soldiers on both sides. The shaped charge warhead punched through the armor plate like it was cardboard. The observers stood in stunned silence. They had just witnessed a weapon that could destroy any tank in the world, fired by a single soldier from a weapon that cost less than $20 to manufacture. The Army ordered immediate mass production. By October 1942, the first M1 bazookas were being rushed to troops preparing for Operation Operation Torch, the invasion of North Africa. There had been no time for extensive training. Most soldiers had never even seen a bazooka before, received a brief demonstration and perhaps one practice shot before going into combat. The weapon was so new that ammunition was scarce. Many bazooka teams landed in North Africa with only 2 rockets per launcher. The German tank crews who would face this weapon had no idea it existed. German intelligence had completely missed the bazooka's development and deployment. As far as Wehrmacht commanders knew, American infantry had no effective anti-tank weapons beyond their inadequate 37mm anti-tank guns, which German tankers derisively called door knockers because they couldn't penetrate German armor. This catastrophic intelligence failure meant German tank tactics in North Africa were designed for an enemy that didn't possess infantry anti-tank weapons. Panzers would advance with minimal infantry support, relying on their armor to shrug off small arms fire. Tank commanders routinely exposed themselves in open hatches for better visibility, unconcerned about infantry who couldn't harm them. These assumptions were about to be shattered in the most violent way possible. The first combat use of the M1 Bazooka occurred during the early hours of November 8, 1942, as American forces landed near Casablanca. Private Robert Murphy of the 1st Infantry Division found himself crouching behind a stone wall, watching a Panzer IV advance toward his position. The German tank was firing its machine guns methodically, clearing buildings and walls with professional efficiency. Murphy had received exactly 20 minutes of instruction on the bazooka he was carrying. He'd never fired one. He'd barely looked at one until 3 days earlier on the transport ship. His assistant gunner, Private James Patterson, was in the same situation. Neither man had any idea whether the weapon would actually work. The Panzer was now 75 yards away. Murphy could see the commander's head protruding from the turret hatch, scanning for targets. Following his minimal training, Murphy aimed at the tank's side armor, thinner than the frontal plate, and squeezed the trigger. The rocket whooshed from the tube with that distinctive sound. For a moment that seemed to last forever, Murphy watched the rocket's bright tail streak toward the Panzer. Then, impact. A brilliant flash of orange and white. The explosion seemed small, almost disappointing. Then the Panzer's hull erupted in secondary explosions, ammunition cooking off, fuel igniting. The tank commander tried to bail out, his uniform already on fire. Within seconds, the 40-ton monster was a funeral pyre. Murphy stared at the burning wreck in disbelief. The crude pipe had just destroyed a machine that represented the pinnacle of German engineering and combat experience. Word of the bazooka's effectiveness spread rapidly through both armies. American infantry, initially skeptical of the untested weapon, began demanding more bazookas and more ammunition. German tank crews, who had intercepted American radio traffic describing the weapon, remained unconvinced. Surely the Americans were exaggerating. One lucky shot meant nothing. Hauptmann Friedrich Steiner, commanding a company of Panzer IVs with the 10th Panzer Division, received reports of the new American weapon during the advance toward Kasserine Pass in February 1943. His response, recorded in the division war diary, reflected typical German confidence. Intelligence reports American infantry now equipped with shoulder-fired rocket weapons. Unlikely these primitive devices pose significant threat to properly handled armor. Crew vigilance remains essential, but no tactical modifications required. This dismissive attitude was widespread throughout the Afrika Korps. German tankers had spent 2 years fighting enemies equipped with various anti-tank weapons. They'd faced British Boys anti-tank rifles that bounced off their armor. They'd survived Soviet anti-tank rifle fire that barely scratched their paint. They'd shrugged off French 25mm anti-tank guns that couldn't penetrate at combat ranges. The idea that Americans, novices at armored warfare, had somehow produced a superior anti-tank weapon seemed absurd. This was the nation whose pre-war tanks had been laughably inadequate, whose tactical doctrine was borrowed from European armies, who had arrived in North Africa with obsolete equipment and untested troops. German tank crews called the bazooka the Ofenrohr, stovepipe, when they bothered to mention it at all.
The name was meant to be mocking. It would soon be spoken in fear.
The education of the Wehrmacht began in earnest at Kasserine Pass. On February 14, 1943, German armor launched a major offensive against inexperienced American forces. The initial attacks went well. American units, poorly positioned and inadequately trained, fell back in disorder. German tank commanders, sensing victory, pushed forward aggressively. Then the bazookas spoke. Lieutenant Hans Kruger, commanding a Panzer III in the spearhead assault, was advancing through a narrow valley when his tank suddenly lurched to a halt. The engine was still running, the tracks were intact, but something was catastrophically wrong. Through his vision port, Kruger saw smoke pouring from the hull. His radio operator was screaming. The driver was clawing at his hatch. Kruger didn't remember bailing out. One moment he was in his command seat, the next he was lying 30 feet from his tank, his uniform smoking, his face burned, watching his Panzer transform into an inferno. He never saw what hit him, never heard the bazooka's distinctive report. The shaped charge warhead had simply punched through his side armor, and the jet of superheated metal had turned his crew compartment into hell. 4 more German tanks died in that valley within 10 minutes. All to weapons the crews never saw fired, all destroyed so quickly that most crews couldn't escape. The German advance faltered, then stopped. Not because of enemy tanks, not because of artillery, because German tank commanders suddenly realized their infantry screens were inadequate against an enemy that could kill armor from concealment at ranges where return fire was impossible. The shaped charge technology that made the bazooka so lethal was based on a principle called the Monroe effect, discovered decades earlier but only recently weaponized. When a hollow charge explosive detonates against armor, it doesn't blast through by brute force. Instead, the shaped cavity focuses the explosive energy into a jet of superheated metal traveling at 25,000 feet per second, faster than a rifle bullet, hot enough to melt steel instantly. This jet, barely wider than a pencil, but devastating in its intensity, would punch through armor plate regardless of the plate's thickness. The bazooka's 2.36-inch warhead could penetrate 4 inches of hardened steel armor. That was enough to defeat any German tank's side or rear armor, and sufficient to penetrate the frontal armor of lighter vehicles. What made this even more devastating was the secondary effects. When that jet of molten metal penetrated the crew compartment, it didn't just create a small hole. It turned everything inside the tank into shrapnel. Fragments of the armor plate itself became projectiles. Any ammunition hit by the jet would detonate. Fuel would ignite. Hydraulic fluid would catch fire. German tank crews began reporting a phenomenon their training had never prepared them for: catastrophic hull penetrations from weapons they couldn't see, couldn't hear until too late, and couldn't defend against at a Panzer IV, which could shrug off multiple hits from American 37mm anti-tank guns, would brew up instantly from a single bazooka round striking the side or rear. Worse, from the German perspective, was the bazooka's ease of use. Unlike anti-tank guns that required crews, training, and positioning, any infantry squad could now kill tanks. A single American soldier, hiding in rubble, in a foxhole, behind a wall, anywhere, could destroy 40 tons of German armor worth hundreds of thousands of Reichsmarks and months of production. The psychological impact was immediate and profound. German tank commanders who had operated with near impunity against infantry suddenly found themselves vulnerable. Every building, every wall, every pile of rubble became a potential death trap. The hunter had become the hunted. By March 1943, after-action reports from German armor units in Tunisia showed a dramatic change in tone. Oberst Rudolf Lang, commanding officer of the 21st Panzer Division, reported to Rommel, "American infantry anti-tank capabilities have been severely underestimated. The shoulder-fired rocket weapon penetrates all standard armor at typical engagement ranges. Casualties among armor crews increasing. Crews report extreme psychological stress.
traditional infantry support tactics proving inadequate. Rommel, who had initially dismissed reports of the bazooka's effectiveness, now ordered immediate tactical changes. German tanks were forbidden from advancing without substantial infantry screens. Tank commanders were ordered to remain buttoned up, sealed inside their tanks with hatches closed, even though this severely limited their visibility. Armor was instructed to avoid urban areas and any terrain that offered concealment to infantry.
These measures helped, but they also fundamentally altered German armor doctrine. Tanks that had been offensive weapons, used to break through enemy lines and exploit breakthroughs, were now forced to operate defensively, constantly worried about infantry ambush. The laughter had stopped. German tank crews weren't joking about stovepipes anymore. They were dying in them. The bazooka's impact multiplied as production ramped up and more American troops received training. By mid-1943, most American infantry squads in combat zones included at least one two-man bazooka team. Some units had multiple teams per platoon. Ammunition that had been scarce in North Africa became plentiful. More importantly, American infantry was learning how to use the weapon effectively. Early doctrine, written by officers who had never fired a bazooka in combat, recommended firing from standing positions at maximum range. Combat veterans quickly developed better tactics. Sergeant Mike Pollock of the 1st Infantry Division developed what became known as the ambush drill. His bazooka teams would position themselves in concealment, wait until German armor was within 50 yards, then fire multiple rockets in rapid succession at the thinnest armor, the side or rear. The first rocket would disable the tank, follow-up shots would ensure its destruction and prevent crew escape. These tactics proved devastatingly effective during the Sicily campaign in July 1943. German armor attempting to counterattack American beachheads was ambushed repeatedly by bazooka teams hidden in the island's numerous stone buildings and walls. Hauptmann Werner Pluskat, commanding a company of Panzer IVs, lost 6 tanks in a single day to bazookas. Not one of his crews saw their attackers before being hit. Pluskat's after-action report, captured after the war, revealed the psychological impact. The enemy rocket weapon has made armor operations in built-up areas nearly impossible. Crews refuse to advance without extensive infantry clearing operations. Even then, morale is severely affected. Men who faced Russian T-34s without fear now show visible stress before entering villages. The weapon's psychological effect exceeds its material damage. The Italian campaign that began in September 1943 became a nightmare for German armor. Italy's mountainous terrain, narrow roads, and countless stone villages created perfect ambush conditions for bazooka teams. German tanks found themselves channeled into kill zones where American infantry could engage from multiple angles. At Monte Cassino, Gefreiter Otto Schmidt of the 1st Fallschirmjäger Division witnessed the destruction of an entire panzer platoon in less than 5 minutes. 4 Tigers, our best tanks, advancing up the road. Invincible, we thought. Then the Americans fired. Not 1 rocket, not 2, it seemed like dozens. All 4 Tigers were burning before their guns could even traverse. The crews, most didn't escape. Those who did were picked off by rifle fire. We called for tank support after that, but the Panzer crews refused, said they wouldn't drive into American infantry positions, said it was suicide. The Tiger tanks, Schmid mentioned, Germany's heaviest and most feared armor, should have been impervious to the bazooka's 2.36-inch warhead. The Tiger's frontal armor was 100 millimeters thick, far exceeding the bazooka's rated penetration. But the bazooka teams weren't shooting at frontal armor. They were waiting until the Tigers exposed their thinner side or rear armor, navigating Italy's winding roads, then firing from positions where return fire was impossible. Even the mighty Tiger, which could shrug off hits from American 75mm tank guns, would brew up instantly when a bazooka round penetrated its rear engine deck. The highly combustible gasoline engine would ignite, and the ammunition stored throughout the hull would cook off in sympathetic detonations that literally blew the turret off the hull. German tank crews began developing their own countermeasures. Some welded additional armor plates to their vehicles' sides and rear, Schürzen or skirt armor. This helped somewhat, but added weight that strained already overtaxed engines and transmissions. Others hung spare track links, sandbags, logs, anything that might prematurely detonate a shaped charge before it hit the main armor. These improvised defenses had limited success. The bazooka's shaped charge warhead was designed to detonate on contact, and even improvised armor often wasn't enough to completely defeat the jet. Moreover, the additional weight slowed the tanks, increased fuel consumption, and made them less maneuverable. Exactly what you didn't want when trying to avoid ambush.
The real problem was psychological. German tank crews had gone from feeling invulnerable to feeling like targets. Every advance into infantry-held territory became an ordeal of stress. Every blind corner, every building, every wall could hide a bazooka team. The sound of the bazooka's launch, that distinctive whoosh, became a harbinger of death that German tankers heard in their nightmares. Unteroffizier Paul Richter, a Panther tank driver who survived the Italian campaign, described the psychological warfare. You couldn't see them, couldn't hear them until they fired. By then, it was too late. We'd be driving through a village, everything quiet. Then whoosh, bang, and the tank behind us would explode, or ahead of us, or beside us. Sometimes multiple rockets from different directions. You never knew when it was coming. The waiting was worse than combat. Some men broke down completely, refused to mount their tanks. We called it Ofenrohr Angst, stovepipe fear. The German High Command recognized the threat. In November 1943, a training directive was issued to all armor units. Quote, "The American shoulder-fired anti-tank rocket weapon must be considered the primary infantry threat to armor. All operations in infantry contested terrain must assume enemy possession of these weapons. Tank commanders are reminded that enemy infantry capabilities now match or exceed enemy armor as a threat to German tanks." End quote. This was an extraordinary admission. For the first time in the war, German armor doctrine acknowledged that infantry, properly equipped, was as dangerous to tanks as enemy tanks were to them. By the time of the Normandy invasion in June 1944, the bazooka had evolved through several variants. The M9 model featured improved electrical systems and better weather sealing. The M9A1 added an optical sight and a more reliable firing mechanism. Most importantly, production had reached nearly 500,000 units, ensuring virtually every American infantry company in Europe had multiple bazooka teams fully stocked with ammunition. The German defenders of Normandy knew what was coming. They'd fought the bazooka in North Africa, Sicily, and Italy. They understood its capabilities. They'd developed countermeasures and tactics, yet they were still unprepared for the scale of the American bazooka deployment. SS Hauptsturmführer Michael Wittmann, one of Germany's most successful tank aces with 138 confirmed kills, encountered the reality of bazooka warfare on June 13, 1944, near Villers-Bocage. Wittmann had just completed one of history's most famous tank actions, single-handedly destroying portions of a British armored column. Emboldened by his success, he advanced into Villers-Bocage itself. American infantry from the 2nd Armored Division was waiting. Wittmann's Tiger was hit by 3 bazooka rounds in rapid succession. One penetrated the rear engine deck, 2 struck the thinner rear whole armor arm. The Tiger, which had survived dozens of encounters with British and Soviet tanks, was crippled in seconds by infantry weapons wielded by soldiers Wittmann probably never saw. Wittmann survived that encounter, his crew abandoned the burning Tiger, but the legend of invincibility surrounding German armor was dying with every bazooka engagement. The mathematics were brutal. America was producing roughly 5,000 bazookas per month. Each cost approximately $18. Each could destroy a Panther tank worth $117,000 and requiring 6 months to manufacture. The industrial calculus was devastating for Germany. American factories could produce bazookas faster than German factories could produce tanks. Every bazooka destroyed in combat was replaced within days. Every German tank destroyed took months to replace, if replacement was possible at all, given Germany's collapsing industrial capacity. The Battle of the Bulge in December 1944 demonstrated how completely the bazooka had altered armored warfare. German commanders planned their Ardennes offensive around achieving tactical surprise and rapid exploitation with armor. The offensive initially succeeded. American forces were caught off guard and fell back in disorder. But even in retreat, American infantry bazooka teams exacted a terrible toll on German armor. At Saint-Vith, at Bastogne, in dozens of small villages and road junctions, German tanks found themselves ambushed by determined infantry wielding bazookas. The German advance, dependent on maintaining momentum, ground to a halt as armor was forced to wait for infantry to clear every building, every crossroads, every potential ambush site. Obersturmbannführer Jochen Peiper, commanding the spearhead 1st SS Panzer Division, lost 30 vehicles, tanks and tank destroyers, to bazookas during his drive towards the Meuse River. Not to American armor, not to artillery, to infantry hiding in buildings and forests with shoulder-fired rockets. His after-action report, later captured, was bitter.
American infantry anti-tank capabilities make rapid exploitation impossible. Even disorganized enemy troops can inflict severe armor casualties when equipped with rocket weapons. Breakthrough tactics developed against poorly equipped enemies are obsolete. By early 1945, as Allied forces pushed into Germany itself, the bazooka had become so commonplace and so effective that German tank crews often abandoned their vehicles at the first sign of infantry resistance. Tanks without infantry support, and Germany's infantry was increasingly depleted, were death traps waiting to be sprung. The statistics told the story of systematic destruction. In the European theater, from June 1944 to May 1945, American bazooka teams claimed over 3,400 German armored vehicles destroyed. This number likely includes some exaggerations and overlapping claims, but even conservative estimates put confirmed bazooka kills above 2,000 vehicles. Each one represented German resources that could never be replaced. More devastating than the material losses was the psychological impact on the entire Wehrmacht. German infantry, who had relied on armor support since 1939, now witnessed their tanks burning from weapons that any enemy soldier might carry. German tank crews, once the elite of the Wehrmacht, were reduced to cautious defensive operations, their tactical flexibility destroyed by the constant threat of infantry ambush. In April 1945, during the final defense of Berlin, many German tanks were abandoned by their crews without firing a shot. When interrogated, crew members repeatedly cited fear of bazookas as a primary factor. They'd watched too many comrades burn. They understood the mathematics of survival, and those mathematics said that being a German tanker in 1945 was a death sentence. The final vindication of the bazooka came from the most unlikely source, the enemy. In 1943, German engineers captured several bazookas in North Africa and Italy. They reverse-engineered the design and produced their own version, the Panzerschreck, tank terror. The Panzerschreck used a larger 88mm rocket and had greater armor penetration, but the design was nearly identical to the American weapon. That Germany, which had pioneered tank warfare and prided itself on superior military technology, felt compelled to copy an American infantry weapon spoke volumes about the bazooka's effectiveness. The engineers who had dismissed it as a primitive stovepipe in 1942 were now frantically producing copies in 1944. The German copies arrived too late and in insufficient numbers. By the time Panzerschrecks reached frontline units in quantity, Germany's position was hopeless. The weapon that might have changed the defensive battles of 1943 arrived only in time for the catastrophic defeats of 1945. After the war, during debriefings of captured German officers, the bazooka came up repeatedly. General Feldmarschall Albert Kesselring, commander of German forces in Italy, stated, "The American infantry anti-tank rocket was among the most effective weapons deployed against our armor. It negated many of our tactical advantages and forced us into defensive postures that ultimately proved unsustainable." General der Panzertruppen Hermann Balck
one of Germany's most skilled armor commanders, was more direct. "We underestimated American infantry weapons development. The bazooka, in particular, was a nasty surprise. It was simple, cheap, effective, and ubiquitous. By 1944, every American infantry squad could kill our tanks. This fundamentally altered the tactical balance. Our armor advantage was neutralized by a weapon that cost less than a military radio." Perhaps the most telling assessment came from a captured Panzer commander's diary found in Berlin in May 1945. The officer, whose name was lost, wrote, "June 1944, we laughed at the American Stovepipe in Tunisia, said it was a toy. Now in Normandy, we've stopped laughing. We've stopped joking about anything. Every village hides death. Every hedgerow conceals American infantry with those damned rockets. Yesterday, Schmidt's Panther took a rocket through the engine. The crew burned. Today, Mueller's Kiger was hit twice. The turret was blown 20 meters from the hull. Tomorrow, perhaps it's my turn. We don't laugh anymore. We just try to survive another day." The human cost of the bazooka's effectiveness was staggering. Approximately 50,000 German tank crewmen were killed in action during World War II. While not all these deaths were caused by bazookas, artillery, anti-tank guns, mines, and enemy tanks all took their toll. Captured German medical reports indicate that a disproportionate number of tank crew casualties after 1943 showed injuries consistent with shaped charge penetration. Severe burns, metal fragment wounds, and the catastrophic trauma associated with internal ammunition detonation.
For the Americans, the bazooka represented a different kind of victory. It was conceived in desperation, designed in weeks, and rushed into production with minimal testing. It violated numerous principles of military procurement. It was too new, too radical, too simple, yet it worked. It worked so well that it remained in U.S. service through the Korean War and influenced anti-tank weapon design for decades. The M20 Super Bazooka of the Korean War used a 3.5-inch rocket with even greater penetration. The design principles established by Lieutenant Ull's original prototype remained unchanged. Simple tube launcher, shaped charge warhead, soldier portable, easy to use. The concept was so successful that virtually every modern military now fields shoulder-fired anti-tank weapons descended from Ull's 1942 innovation. In 1985, at a reunion of American and German veterans in Virginia, former Colonel Hermann Buchner, who had commanded a Panzer company in Italy and France, was asked about the weapons he most feared during the war. "The Russian T-34 was dangerous," Buchner said. "British Shermans in quantity could overwhelm us. But the weapon I feared most? The American bazooka, because it meant every enemy soldier was an anti-tank weapon. We could handle enemy tanks. We had tactics. We had training. We had our own armor. But how do you fight when every infantry squad can kill your tank? When every building, every foxhole, every pile of rubble might hide a soldier with a rocket that will burn you alive?" He paused, looking at the American veterans in the room. "You called it a bazooka. We called it Ofenrohr, or sometimes Panzerknacker, tank cracker. Whatever the name, it changed everything. We went from hunters to hunted, from confident to terrified. Your general sent you to fight our panzers with that simple tube. We laughed. Then we stopped laughing. Then we started dying." The room fell silent. An American veteran, former Sergeant James Holland, who had carried a bazooka through France and Germany, spoke up. "We were scared too, scared of your tanks, your experience, your reputation. They gave us this thing, this pipe with a rocket, and told us to fight panzers. Most of us had never seen a tank before basic training. But it worked. God help us. It worked. Every time. The technical specifications of the M1 Bazooka tell only part of the story. Length, 54 inches. Weight, 13.25 pounds loaded. Effective range, 150 yards. Maximum range, 400 yards. Muzzle velocity, 265 feet per second. Armor penetration, 4 inches at 90 degrees. These numbers don't capture what made the weapon revolutionary. They don't explain why German tank commanders who had survived Kursk and Normandy developed nervous tics at the thought of entering villages. They don't convey the terror of sitting in a steel box knowing that invisible infantry equipped with $18 weapons could kill you instantly. The true measure of the bazooka's impact lies in what it changed. Before the bazooka, infantry were effectively helpless against armor. Tanks could advance with near impunity against infantry positions, breaking defensive lines and creating the breakthroughs that defined mobile warfare. Infantry anti-tank weapons existed, but they were either too heavy to be portable, anti-tank guns, or too weak to be effective, anti-tank rifles. After the bazooka, armor could never again operate safely in infantry-contested terrain. Every advance required extensive infantry clearing operations. Every village became a potential graveyard for tanks. The fundamental dynamic of armored warfare shifted from infantry must retreat from armor to armor must respect infantry. This shift didn't just affect German tactical calculations. It influenced post-war military doctrine worldwide. The Soviet RPG series, the British Piat, the Swedish Panzers, the Chinese Type 69, all shoulder-fired anti-tank weapons, all descended from principles proven by the bazooka. Modern weapons like the AT-4, the Javelin, and the NLAW continue the lineage. The bazooka's legacy extends beyond anti-tank warfare. It demonstrated that asymmetric weapons, cheap, simple, widely distributed, could negate expensive technological advantages, a principle that would prove relevant in conflicts from Vietnam to Afghanistan to modern Ukraine. The idea that motivated infantry armed with the right weapons could defeat armored forces wasn't new, but the bazooka proved it was practical. At the National World War II Museum in New Orleans, a restored M9A1 bazooka sits in a display case. The placard lists its specifications and service history, but the most striking item in the display is a German tactical manual from 1944.
Captured in Normandy. The manual includes a full page devoted to the Amerikanische Panzerbuchse, American tank rifle, advising tank crews on defensive measures. Below the manual is a translated excerpt. The enemy infantry rocket weapon poses an extreme threat to all armored vehicles. Crews must assume all enemy infantry are equipped with this weapon. Advance into enemy-held urban terrain is forbidden without adequate infantry screening. Tank commanders observing enemy infantry at ranges below 200 meters must immediately withdraw or request infantry support. The rocket weapon's psychological effect on crews must be countered through rigorous training and iron discipline. The irony is thick. German tactical doctrine, developed over years of successful armored warfare, had been reduced to stay away from American infantry. The hunters had become the prey. In the decades since World War II, military historians have debated the bazooka's true impact. Some argue it was tactically significant, but not strategically decisive. Germany lost because of industrial capacity, strategic mistakes, and fighting on multiple fronts, not because of any single weapon system. But this misses the point. The bazooka didn't need to be strategically decisive to be revolutionary. It fundamentally altered the tactical dynamics of armored warfare. It forced German commanders to divert resources to infantry screening operations. It slowed German armor advances. It destroyed irreplaceable equipment and killed experienced crews. Most importantly, it demonstrated that American industrial innovation could produce weapons that matched or exceeded German equivalents. The German tank crews who laughed at the toy bazooka in November 1942 were veterans of successful campaigns across Europe. They had earned their confidence through victory after victory. Their Panzers had crushed Poland, France, and Greece. They'd survived the brutal fighting in Russia. They had every reason to believe that crude American weapons wielded by inexperienced troops posed no serious threat. They were catastrophically wrong. The weapon they dismissed as a carnival toy destroyed thousands of German armored vehicles. It killed tens of thousands of German soldiers. It forced tactical revisions across the entire Wehrmacht. It inspired German weapons development, and it created a psychological atmosphere of terror among tankers who once thought themselves invincible. The transformation from mockery to terror took less than 6 months. By mid-1943, no German tank crew was joking about bazookas. By 1944, the Ofenrohr, the stovepipe, was among the most feared weapons in the American arsenal. By 1945, the mere presence of American infantry was enough to make German armor commanders think twice about advancing. The last known German assessment of the bazooka comes from a report written in March 1945 by General Meyer Wolfer Nering, a veteran armor commander who had fought in Poland, France, Russia, North Africa, and Western Europe. His evaluation was submitted as part of a broader analysis of Allied weapon systems. The enemy infantry anti-tank rocket weapon represents one of the war's most significant tactical innovations. Simple in concept, cheap to produce, easy to use, yet devastatingly effective against all armored types. It has negated much of our tactical armor advantage and forced us into defensive postures that limit armor's offensive potential. More significantly, it has demonstrated the Americans' capacity for rapid weapons innovation and mass production. A weapon that did not exist in 1941 was in widespread use by 1943 and became ubiquitous by 1944. This development cycle, from concept to battlefield dominance, represents a capability we cannot match. Our initial assessment that the weapon was primitive and ineffective was perhaps the most costly intelligence failure of the armor war. We underestimated not the weapon itself, but the tactical doctrine and industrial capacity that supported it. By the time we understood its true capabilities, the tactical initiative had shifted permanently against us. Future assessments of enemy capabilities must account for American industrial and innovative capacity, dismissing their weapons as toys or primitive because they differ from our engineering philosophy has proven catastrophically wrong. The bazooka is simple. It is also lethal. Sometimes simplicity is superiority. The report was filed 2 months before Germany's surrender. By then, the point was academic. The laughter had long since stopped.
Today, the bazooka is remembered as an iconic weapon of World War II, alongside the M1 Garand, the Thompson submachine gun, and the B-17 bomber. But unlike those weapons, which were improvements on existing concepts, the bazooka represented a fundamental innovation. It created a weapon category that didn't previously exist: the man-portable, disposable anti-tank rocket launcher. Veterans who carried bazookas into combat remember it with mixed emotions. It was heavy, awkward, and made you a priority target for every German soldier who saw it. The backblast was dangerous. Stand too close to a wall when firing, and the reflected exhaust could kill you. The rockets sometimes failed to detonate. The electrical firing system could short out in rain, but it worked when it mattered, when German armor was bearing down on your position, when retreat wasn't an option and death seemed certain. The bazooka worked. It gave infantry soldiers the power to fight back against the most feared weapons on the battlefield. It transformed them from victims into hunters. Private First Class Eugene Sledge, who fought in the Pacific, described the psychological impact. Knowing we had bazookas changed everything. Japanese tanks weren't as good as German ones, but they were still tanks, and we were infantry. Before bazookas, seeing enemy armor meant we were in serious trouble. After bazookas, we had options. We could fight. That sense of capability, of having the tools to do the job, it's hard to overstate how important that was for morale. The weapon's influence extended beyond its direct combat application. The bazooka demonstrated that World War II would be won not just by brave soldiers and brilliant generals, but by industrial capacity and innovative engineering. America's ability to conceive, design, test, produce, and deploy
deploy a revolutionary weapon system within 18 months showcased capabilities that Germany couldn't match. German industry produced superb weapons, the Tiger tank, the Me-262 jet fighter, and the V-2 rocket. But these were expensive, complex, and produced in limited quantities. American industry produced good weapons in overwhelming quantities. The Sherman tank wasn't as good as the Panther, but America built 50 Shermans for every Panther Germany produced. The bazooka wasn't as powerful as the Panzerschreck, but America fielded 10 bazookas for every Panzerschreck Germany did. This industrial philosophy, adequate weapons in overwhelming quantities, proved decisive. German tankers might survive one encounter with a bazooka, but they faced dozens of encounters. German armor might defeat one American infantry company, but 10 more companies waited behind them, all equipped with bazookas, all ready to fight. The mathematics of attrition were brutal and unavoidable. Germany started the war with approximately 3,500 tanks. They produced roughly 25,000 more during the war, for a total of about 28,500 armored fighting vehicles. America produced 88,000 tanks during the same period, plus 500,000 bazookas. The numbers told the story of inevitable defeat. In 1953, Lieutenant Edward Uhl, the bazooka's principal inventor, was interviewed for a military history project. The interviewer asked him if he had any idea, during those frantic months in 1942, that his weapon would become so significant. He changed everything. Japanese tanks weren't as good as German ones, but they were still tanks, and we were infantry. Before bazookas, seeing enemy armor meant we were in serious trouble. After bazookas, we had options. We could fight. That sense of capability, of having the tools to do the job, it's hard to overstate how important that was for morale. No, I had no idea it would become the infantry anti-tank weapon. The real credit belongs to the soldiers who used it in combat. They figured out the tactics, developed the techniques, and proved it worked under the worst possible conditions. We gave them a tool. They turned it into a weapon that changed armored warfare. War is hell, and weapons make that hell more efficient. The bazooka did its job. I'm glad it was on our side. The combat records preserve hundreds of bazooka engagement reports, each one a small story of desperate men fighting enormous machines. Most follow a similar pattern: German armor advancing, American infantry taking cover.
It should seem as if someone is narrating a real story, that too in a very deep and dramatic style, so that the story generates more interest. The bazooka team positioning for a flank shot, the distinctive whoosh bang of the rocket launch, the explosion, the burning tank. But some reports stand out for their dramatic intensity, like the action at Mortagne, France on August 7, 1944, when Staff Sergeant John Hawke's bazooka team stopped a projected German Panther tank at point-blank range. The Panther had overrun Hawke's position, crushing his foxhole. Hawke and his loader crawled out behind the tank, assembled the bazooka, which had been knocked apart in the collapse, and fired into the Panther's engine deck from 10 yards away. The resulting explosion was so violent it knocked both Americans unconscious. They woke up to find themselves covered in debris next to a Panther tank burning so hot they couldn't approach closer than 50 yards. Or the engagement at Aachen, Germany, in October 1944, when Corporal Ralph Capral's team engaged a Tiger tank in street fighting. The Tiger, supported by infantry, was systematically destroying the building Capral's platoon was defending. Capral, a former high school quarterback from Pennsylvania, calculated the angles, positioned himself in a second-story window, and fired down onto the Tiger's thin top armor as it passed below. The rocket penetrated the turret roof, and the subsequent ammunition explosion literally lifted the 68-ton Tiger off the ground before it crashed back down, a total wreck. These individual acts of courage were repeated thousands of times across Europe and the Pacific. Each one represented an infantryman choosing to fight rather than flee. Each one was made possible by a weapon that gave them a realistic chance of survival and victory. The German tankers on the receiving end of these attacks weren't cowards or incompetents. They were professionals doing their jobs under impossible circumstances. Many were veterans of years
years of combat. They'd survived battles that had killed most of their comrades. They understood tactics, knew their equipment, and fought with skill and determination. But none of that mattered when a bazooka rocket punched through their armor. Training couldn't stop shaped charge warheads. Experience didn't deflect rockets. Courage was irrelevant when your crew compartment filled with superheated metal traveling at hypersonic velocity. The randomness was perhaps the worst part. A German tank commander could do everything right: maintain proper spacing, keep infantry screens forward, stay buttoned up, avoid obvious ambush sites, and still die because an American soldier hidden in rubble 100 yards away fired a rocket that happened to hit a vulnerable spot. There was no defense except avoiding contact with American infantry entirely, which was tactically impossible. This helplessness bred the terror that German veterans describe. It wasn't fear of a superior enemy. German soldiers had faced superior enemies and fought effectively. It was fear of a weapon that negated all their advantages. The Panthers' thick armor meant nothing. The powerful guns couldn't engage targets they couldn't see. The superior training and experience didn't help when death came without warning from an invisible enemy. By late 1944, German tank crew casualties had reached the point where experienced commanders were increasingly rare. The Wehrmacht was filling Panzer units with hastily trained recruits who had perhaps 50 hours in their vehicles before being sent into combat. These novices, facing American veteran infantry equipped with weapons that terrified even German tankers, often panicked at the first sign of contact. After-action reports from late 1944 and early 1945 frequently described German armor withdrawing from positions they should have held, abandoning vehicles that were still functional, or simply refusing to advance into areas where American infantry might be present. This wasn't cowardice. It was rational calculation by men who understood the odds of survival. The statistical analysis tells the story. In 1943, the average German tank in combat survived approximately 12 engagements before being destroyed or damaged beyond repair. By 1945, that number had dropped to fewer than 3 engagements. Some of this decline was due to increased Allied air power and improved American armor, but a significant factor was the ubiquity of bazookas, which meant every infantry encounter risked tank destruction. The American tactical doctrine evolved to maximize bazooka effectiveness. Infantry units were taught to allow German armor to penetrate their positions, then hit the tanks from behind with bazookas once they'd passed the front line. This shoulder defense tactic was psychologically difficult. It required soldiers to let tanks approach without shooting, but devastatingly effective. German armor would advance, thinking they'd broken through, only to discover they'd driven into a kill zone where bazookas could engage their vulnerable rear armor.
Combined arms tactics integrated bazookas with other weapons. Artillery would pin German infantry in place, preventing them from screening their armor. Machine guns would suppress German infantry attempting to protect tanks. Then bazooka teams would maneuver to flanking positions and destroy the isolated armor. These coordinated attacks turned German combined arms doctrine, which relied on tanks and infantry supporting each other, into a liability. The Germans tried to adapt. They developed new tactics emphasizing armor-infantry coordination. They produced the Panzerschreck and Panzerfaust to give their infantry similar capabilities. They experimented with standoff rocket artillery to suppress American infantry before tanks advanced. Nothing worked consistently because the fundamental problem was unsolvable. American infantry had weapons that could kill German tanks, and those weapons were everywhere. The final toll of the bazooka's effectiveness can never be precisely calculated. Of the approximately 28,500 German armored fighting vehicles produced during World War II, roughly 20,000 were destroyed or captured. How many fell to bazookas versus other causes, enemy tanks, artillery, mines, air attack, is impossible to determine with precision. American after-action reports claim over 3,400 German vehicles destroyed by bazookas, but but these numbers are certainly inflated by overclaiming and confusion in combat. Conservative military historians estimate that bazookas accounted for at least 1,500 confirmed German armored vehicle kills, possibly as many as 2,500. Each destroyed vehicle represented approximately $100,000 worth of equipment in 1940s dollars, thousands of man-hours of production, and, most critically, months of irreplaceable manufacturing capacity. More significant than material losses were the operational impacts. German armor operations were constrained by fear of bazooka ambush. Advances that should have been swift became cautious. Exploitations that might have achieved breakthrough were abandoned. Tactical flexibility was sacrificed to reduce exposure to infantry anti-tank weapons. These operational constraints contributed to German defeats even when bazookas didn't directly destroy German armor. At the Battle of the Bulge, for example, German commanders chose routes and tactics based partly on avoiding American infantry concentrations known to have bazookas. These decisions delayed the German advance, allowing American reinforcements to arrive and establish defensive positions. The psychological warfare aspect was equally important. German tank crews who survived bazooka attacks, and many did, thanks to improved abandonment procedures and better armor on later vehicles, spread stories of the weapon's lethality throughout their units. This created a feedback loop where fear of bazookas made crews more likely to panic when engaged, which made them more vulnerable to follow-up attacks. American psychological operations exploited this fear. Loudspeaker broadcasts to German positions would emphasize American bazooka capabilities. Leaflets dropped on German troops showed photographs of destroyed German tanks with captions like, "The bazooka sees all German armor." These propaganda efforts, combined with the weapon's genuine effectiveness, created an atmosphere of dread around American infantry anti-tank capabilities. In the end, the bazooka's greatest achievement might be the simplest. It gave American infantry soldiers the tools to fight armored warfare on equal terms. Before the bazooka, facing enemy armor meant hoping your supporting weapons could help or that friendly tanks would arrive in time. After the bazooka, infantry could defend themselves, could take the initiative, could hunt enemy armor rather than fleeing from it. This transformation from helpless targets to capable anti-armor fighters changed the fundamental dynamics of ground combat. It meant that German armor, which had dominated European battlefields since 1939, could no longer operate with the freedom that had made blitzkrieg tactics so effective. Every field, every forest, every village became potential hunting ground for American infantry with their stovepipes. The German tank crews who laughed at the bazooka in November 1942 couldn't have imagined this future. They saw a crude weapon carried by inexperienced troops, and they assumed it was another example of American industrial quantity over quality. They were wrong on every count. The bazooka wasn't crude, it was elegantly simple. Its users weren't inexperienced for long. They learned fast and taught others. And it wasn't an example of quantity over quality. It was both. Simple enough to mass-produce, effective enough to kill any tank, and distributed widely enough to be everywhere German armor needed to fear it. By May 1945, when Germany surrendered, the transformation was complete. The Wehrmacht that had begun the war as masters of armored warfare ended it terrified of enemy infantry. The Panzer arm that had crushed Poland and France had been systematically destroyed, not primarily by enemy tanks or aircraft, but by foot soldiers with shoulder-fired rockets. The laughter that Oberfeldwebel Hoffmann and his crew had shared in November 1942, watching American troops carry pipes to fight Panzers, had been silenced forever. Hoffmann himself died in May 1943 when his Panzer IV was destroyed by a bazooka team outside Tunis. His gunner, Ernst Weber, who had joked about the Americans attacking with carnival toys, survived the war with severe burns from a bazooka hit in Italy in 1944. In a post-war interview, Weber was asked about his first impression of the bazooka. He was silent for a long moment before answering. "We laughed. We actually laughed. We thought it was a joke, that the Americans were so desperate they'd given their infantry pipe bombs. Then it killed Hoffmann. Then it killed Schmidt, then Bauer, and Vogel, and Richter, and so many others. We stopped laughing after that. We stopped laughing about anything.
Every time we mounted our tanks, we wondered if today would be the day some American boy we'd never see would fire that stovepipe and turn our Panzer into our coffin. The worst part, they were right to give it to them. It worked. God help us, it worked perfectly. We were the joke, not them. We just didn't know it yet. The Republic P-47 Thunderbolt and the M1 Bazooka shared almost nothing in common, except this: they were both dismissed as inadequate by German veterans who had years of combat experience, and they were both proven devastatingly effective by American forces who understood that sometimes the best weapon isn't the most sophisticated, it's the one that's good enough, available everywhere, and wielded by people determined to win. The bazooka's legacy lives on in every modern infantry anti-tank weapon. The RPG-7, used in conflicts from Vietnam to Ukraine. The AT-4, standard infantry anti-tank weapon for NATO forces. The Javelin with its fire-and-forget capability, all descendants of Lieutenant Ull's 1942 innovation, all proving that the best weapons are those that give individual soldiers the power to effect tactical outcomes. At Arlington National Cemetery, Section 60 holds the graves of many World War II infantry veterans. Among them are dozens of men who carried bazookas in combat. Their headstones list their units and ranks, but not the specific weapons they used. Yet their contribution was significant. They took a revolutionary weapon into battle, proved it worked under the worst possible conditions, and forever changed the relationship between infantry and armor. In Germany, in the military cemeteries where fallen Wehrmacht soldiers rest, thousands of tankers lie buried. Many died to Allied tanks, artillery, or air attack, but a significant number fell to a weapon their commanders had dismissed as a toy. Their deaths weren't meaningless. They were soldiers doing their duty under impossible circumstances, but they were victims of perhaps the greatest weapons underestimation in military history. The metal pipe that German tank crews laughed at in November 1942 destroyed their Panzers by 1945. The toy became a terror. The joke became a nightmare, and the laughter turned to screams that echoed through burning steel. The sky had belonged to the Thunderbolt, the ground belonged to the bazooka, and both had proven that American ingenuity, backed by industrial might and wielded by determined soldiers, could overcome any enemy's tactical brilliance or technological advantage. The German tank crews who laughed had learned their lesson, those who survived at least. The rest learned it in the last seconds of their lives, when a whooshing sound split the air and their impregnable fortress of steel became their tomb. They stopped laughing. They never laughed again.